From the moment she was born, the hut was filled with uneasy silence. Most children cried loudly when they entered the world, but she had not made a sound. Her tiny chest rose and fell with steady breath, her dark eyes wide and alert, but not a single wail escaped her lips. The midwives exchanged worried glances, whispering that perhaps the spirits had taken her voice at birth. Her mother cradled her close, weeping with a mixture of love and dread, for she knew how villages talked, how quickly silence could become suspicion. As she grew, the silence became her constant companion. Other children shouted, laughed, and wailed in mischief, but she expressed herself through her eyes and her hands. Her gaze was piercing, speaking emotions words could not capture. When she wanted food, she tapped her lips and pointed. When she was happy, her whole face brightened like dawn breaking across the hills. When angered, she would cross her arms and stare so fiercely that even grown men sometimes faltered under her gaze. Though she could not utter a word, her presence was never small. The villagers were divided in their view of her. Some believed she was cursed, marked by the gods to live without a voice, as though silence itself was her punishment for a sin from a previous life. Mothers pulled their children away from her when she approached, muttering that bad luck might be contagious. Others, however, saw something different. They claimed she was blessed, a child of spirits who needed no words because her soul was too powerful for human language. They said her silence allowed her to hear what others could not: the whisper of leaves, the hum of the river, the sigh of wind across the fields. Her life was not easy. Children mocked her, imitating her attempts to gesture and laughing when she grew frustrated. Some threw stones and ran away, chanting cruel names. Yet there were also moments of gentleness. An elderly woman, half-blind and wrinkled like dry bark, often invited her to sit by the fire and taught her to weave baskets. She told her, "Words are not the only way to speak, child. The hands speak, the eyes speak, the heart speaks louder than anything." The girl would smile and bend over the weaving, her fingers quick and delicate, proving that even silence had a rhythm. Her family loved her, though they carried the burden of whispers from neighbors. Her father sometimes sat quietly with her at night, pointing at the stars, drawing shapes with his finger in the air so she could nod or shake her head. He wished he could hear her voice even once, but he never let his sadness turn into rejection. Her mother defended her fiercely, scolding anyone who called her cursed, saying, "A child without a voice is still a child with a soul." Even so, in her heart, her mother prayed every night that some miracle might come, that one day her daughter would wake with sound trembling on her lips. Seasons passed, and the girl's silence became part of the rhythm of the village. When she passed, people would murmur, some bowing their heads in awe, others spitting on the ground to ward off what they feared. She grew into a graceful young woman, her silence shaping her character like a river shaping stone. She was observant, noticing small things others overlooked: the way a person's hands trembled when they lied, the way animals moved before rain, the way clouds thickened in warning before storms. Though no words crossed her lips, she carried an awareness that made others uneasy, as though she understood truths that should remain hidden. Despite the shadows of suspicion around her, there were also those who sought her quiet presence. Some villagers, plagued by troubles, found peace in simply sitting beside her, as though her silence absorbed their burdens. Young children, too innocent to understand curses or blessings, often ran to her, tugging her hand and asking her to play. She would laugh soundlessly, her mouth curving into wide smiles as she spun with them in circles or carved small toys out of wood with nimble fingers. Yet the whispers never fully ceased. When a harvest failed, some blamed her silence. When a child fell sick, others muttered that her gaze carried ill omens. And when thunder cracked louder than expected, old men shook their heads, saying the gods had taken her voice because it was too dangerous for the world. In this mixture of fear, reverence, and cruelty, she grew into a woman caught between love and rejection, belonging and exile. Still, she never wept in front of them. She carried her silence with dignity, as though it were a cloak spun from shadows and moonlight. She had no voice to defend herself, but she had a spirit unyielding to scorn. In the depths of her heart, something waited, something vast and unknown, like a river dammed for too long. She did not know it yet, nor did anyone else, but her silence was not an absence. It was a gathering. And one day when the right night came, when the world least expected it, that silence would break, not with weakness but with doom. Rumors are like smoke. They creep through cracks, rise from nothing, and soon fill every space until breathing becomes difficult. Around the silent girl, whispers grew just like that, thin at first, but thickening until the whole village seemed to choke on them. Her quiet nature had long been a subject of unease, But as she grew older, beauty sharpened her features and grace shaped her movements. The murmurs became heavier, tinged with both fear and envy. Some claimed her silence was not natural but chosen, that she withheld her voice because it was too powerful. They said if she ever opened her mouth, words would spill like curses, bringing famine, sickness, or storms. An old man swore he had seen her staring into the river one night, and in its ripples, he heard a faint hum, though she never moved her lips. She speaks with spirits, he told anyone who would listen, and spirits answer her. The tale spread quickly, each retelling adding more shadows until the girl was no longer seen as merely voiceless, but as someone carrying unseen forces inside her. Others disagreed. They said she was harmless, perhaps even blessed. Women who could not conceive prayed near her, believing her silence might soften the ears of the gods. Hunters returning from long journeys sometimes claimed their luck improved when she watched them leave, her quiet gaze guiding their steps. Children, too young to care about curses, still tugged her skirts and asked her to play, unafraid of what adults feared. For them, her silence was comforting, like the hush before dawn. But even as a few revered her, envy began to coil among her peers. Other girls resented how the elders spoke of her mysterious presence, how some young men looked at her as though she were woven from something rarer than flesh. What is she, they scoffed. A girl with no voice, yet she steals attention with her eyes. Their jealousy dripped into the well of rumors, and soon they whispered that her beauty was unnatural, bought at the price of her voice. Perhaps, they said, her voice had been sacrificed to make her appealing. Perhaps she had bargained with unseen beings for her grace. The more people spoke, the less they remembered truth. A woman who once pitied her now crossed the road when she saw her coming. A man who once shared food with her family now muttered prayers when her shadow touched his door. Her silence, once simply part of her, became a canvas for every fear, every superstition, every grudge. Yet the girl endured it all with quiet strength. She had no voice to deny or explain, so she let their words pass over her like wind over stone. But though she showed no outward anger, she felt the weight pressing in. Each whisper seemed to follow her, clinging like dust she could not wash away. Her gestures, once understood by her family and a few close friends, began to be twisted. If she pointed to the sky, someone said she was calling thunder. If she touched her chest, they claimed she was hiding a spirit inside. The line between fear and envy blurred until it was impossible to tell which burned hotter. Fear made them watch her every move, and envy made them want her gone. Together they turned her silence into something dangerous. The villagers did not yet know it, but in weaving her into a tale of curses and power, they were sealing their own fate. For every rumor planted, for every suspicion whispered in the dark, something in the world stirred, as if the silence itself was listening, waiting, and gathering strength. By the time the season of storms approached, the girl could no longer step into the market without heads turning, whispers buzzing like flies in her wake. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men muttered that no good could come from her presence. And behind it all, envy grinned, feeding the flames. She was still the same silent girl, but in the minds of the people she had already become something else. A threat, a warning, a vessel of fate. What none of them realized was that their whispers were not harmless. Words, once spoken, take root in the world and the world listens. They thought they were only gossiping about a voiceless girl. In truth, they were awakening something that had slept in silence for far too long. Her family had lived for years under the weight of whispers. Every market day, neighbors' eyes followed them, sharp with suspicion, sharp with envy. Some said they had birthed a curse. Others claimed they were harboring a secret gift too dangerous to leave untied. The burden pressed heavier as seasons turned. Suitors who once looked her way began to turn their faces, muttering that no man should take a wife who could not speak. Yet one evening, as the sun sank red behind the hills, an offer arrived that no family in their position could easily refuse. He was a wealthy man, older than her by many years, his hair streaked with gray and his hands heavy with rings. His voice carried authority, and his presence filled the room like smoke, thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. He had heard the rumors, of course, everyone had. But instead of recoiling, he smiled. A silent bride, he said, is a blessing. No backtalk, no gossip, no unnecessary chatter. She will be obedient, and that is all a man needs. His words stung her like thorns, but her family only bowed their heads, their eyes darting nervously to the gold he carried. The bargain was set not with joy but with resignation. Her stepmother, perhaps jealous of her quiet grace, pushed hardest for it, whispering that this marriage would lift them from poverty, that her silence would finally serve a purpose. Her father, weary and bent by years of toil, said little, but his silence was its own kind of consent. Some relatives frowned, but none spoke against it. To them the match seemed practical, even fortunate. Better to see her cloaked in fine fabrics than to live forever under the weight of rumors. The girl, voiceless as she was, could not protest. She could only lower her eyes and feel the decision tighten around her like a rope. Inside, a storm churned, confusion, sorrow, a quiet anger she could never put into words. She had always endured the whispers, the stares, the fear. But now her own blood was delivering her to a man who saw her not as a daughter, not as a human, but as a commodity, a prize of silence to adorn his household. Preparations began at once. The wealthy man sent gifts, bolts of bright cloth, beads that shimmered in the light, livestock for feasts. The village women, even those who once whispered against her, now came to peer at the treasures, clicking their tongues in approval. Their envy softened into hunger, if not for her, then for what she represented. Men who had scorned her silence now grumbled that they had been foolish to dismiss her. But it was too late. The bargain had already bound her future. On the day of the betrothal, drums beat low and steady. The girl was dressed in garments finer than anything she had ever touched. Yet beneath the weight of the cloth, she felt caged, each fold a reminder of the decision made without her voice. She sat still, her eyes cast down, her heart aching with words she could never speak. Her silence, once mocked, had now become her most valued trait, but valued only because it meant control, obedience, a life lived without protest. The wealthy man smiled as he looked at her, pleased with the bargain he had struck. To him, she was not a bride but a possession, silent and therefore perfect. To her family, she was a bridge to comfort and respectability. To the villagers, she had become a lesson in envy and opportunism. But to herself, she remained what she had always been, a silent girl with a soul full of unspoken storms. What no one realized, not her family, not her new husband, not even the villagers, was that silence, like all things, has a breaking point. And when it breaks, it does not whisper. It roars. The wedding day arrived with a blaze of color and sound. Drums thundered through the village from dawn, carrying news that the wealthy man had claimed a bride unlike any other. Women prepared feasts with steaming pots of spiced stew, roasted meats, and baskets of fresh bread, while men hung lanterns that swung in the breeze like captured stars. Children ran barefoot, chasing each other between guests' legs, their laughter rising above the hum of conversation. It was a day of celebration, but beneath the beauty of it all lay a darker rhythm, one that pulsed in whispers and mocking smiles. She was dressed in layers of radiant cloth, dyed in deep reds and golds that shimmered as she moved. Beads rattled softly in her braids, and her skin glowed with oil that caught the light. Yet she felt none of the joy the garments promised. Her face was serene, her eyes steady, but her silence wrapped her tighter than any fabric could. As she walked into the feast, all eyes turned to her, not in admiration alone, but in curiosity, in judgment, in cruelty hidden behind grins. The wealthy man beamed, proud of the spectacle. He paraded her before the crowd like a trophy, showing how even the most whispered-about girl had bent to his will. Guests praised him, slapped his back, and spoke loudly of how lucky he was. "A bride who cannot talk back," one man laughed, lifting his drink high. "What more could a husband ask for?" His companions chuckled, glancing at her, some pitying, others sneering. Their words pierced her heart, but she did not flinch. Her silence, the very thing mocked, became her shield. The feast spread wide across the square. Tables groaned under the weight of food, and dancers spun to the beat of drums, their feet kicking up dust that glowed in the firelight. Masks painted with bright colors twirled and clashed, representing spirits of joy, fertility, and mischief. Laughter echoed everywhere, sharp and unrelenting. But she heard it differently. It rang hollow, laced with cruelty, as though every laugh was a blade turned her way. Even women who once spoke gently to her now leaned close to whisper, their voices dripping with scorn. What will happen when he grows tired of her silence? What kind of mother can a voiceless woman be? Their words, though hushed, cut deeper than the drums could cover. Yet through it all, she sat still beside her new husband. Her gaze was calm, almost unsettling. The more they mocked her, the steadier her eyes became, as if she saw something none of them could. While others ate and drank greedily, she lifted her cup slowly, deliberately, her hands graceful in their quiet defiance. She did not laugh. She did not dance. She simply watched, her silence pressing on them in ways they could not name. A few villagers shifted uncomfortably under her stare, as if her muteness was no longer weakness but judgment. The wealthy man, already drunk with pride and wine, paid no mind to the unease. He roared with laughter at every joke, urging the musicians louder, the dancers wilder, the feast richer. He wanted the world to see his power, to see that he had taken the girl who was once whispered about and placed her beneath his roof. But even as he gloated, the night carried an unease, a hush that crept between bursts of noise. When the wind stirred, lanterns flickered, and the shadows lengthened across the ground like reaching fingers. The villagers ignored the signs, too busy mocking and feasting to notice. But she noticed. Her calm eyes followed the flames, the shadows, the way the sky seemed to grow darker though the night had barely begun. A storm brewed inside her, not of words for she had none, but of something older, something waiting. She did not know its shape yet, but she felt it coil within her, patient as the moon climbing the horizon. As the feast stretched deep into the night, the laughter grew harsher, the mocking sharper. Some guests even imitated her silence, placing fingers over their lips and rolling their eyes in cruel mimicry. Her husband chuckled, taking their ridicule as entertainment. Yet through it all she sat as still as stone, her gaze never faltering. There was no anger in her eyes, only a strange, unnerving calm, as if she had already glimpsed what none of them could see. The drums rolled on, the dancers spun, the food dwindled and the wine flowed. But beneath the noise, beneath the laughter and mockery, the air grew heavier. It was as if the night itself waited, holding its breath, watching her. And she, the silent bride, waited too, her calm gaze promising that silence, once broken, would not come gently. It would come like a storm. In the chamber adorned with heavy curtains and dimly lit by the flicker of oil lamps, the young bride sat silently. The village outside still buzzed faintly with laughter and drunken songs from the wedding feast, but inside the room, silence pressed down like a suffocating weight. Her husband, proud and arrogant, looked upon her as though she were a prize he had purchased, certain her muteness meant obedience. He mistook her silence for submission, her lowered eyes for weakness, her stillness for acceptance. He believed, as the whispers in the village had assured him, that a woman without a voice could never defy, never resist, never shatter a man's authority. Yet as the minutes stretched, the air inside the chamber seemed to thicken. Shadows from the lamps lengthened and twisted unnaturally across the walls, curling like black fingers. Her husband laughed at first, lifting a goblet of palm wine to his lips, mocking her blank face. "Even now," he sneered, "you sit dumb, a doll made for me." But though she did not speak, her eyes lifted to meet his. They were calm, unnervingly calm, like a still pond reflecting a storm above. He felt something stir uneasily in his chest, though he shook it off, convincing himself that it was nothing more than drink. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the wooden shutters though the night had been calm only moments before. The lamps guttered, their flames shivering as if in fear. The silence grew heavier, no longer empty but alive, as though every corner of the room held its breath. Her husband felt it then, the awareness that he was not alone with her. Though her lips never parted, there was the faintest echo, a vibration in the air, like a murmur rising from deep within the earth. He turned toward her sharply, but her mouth remained closed, her face still serene. Only her eyes gleamed brighter, reflecting not the lamplight but something deeper, something older. Suddenly he remembered the stories whispered about her since birth, that she had been born without a voice because spirits had stolen it, hiding it inside her until the appointed time. The elders had warned quietly in secret circles, that silence was not always emptiness, sometimes it was a vessel. But he had laughed at such tales, dismissing them as superstition. Now, alone with her, he felt their weight like a stone on his chest. As the hour deepened into midnight, a strange chill spread through the room. His laughter faltered, replaced by unease. He demanded she look away to bow her head, but she did not. She sat upright, poised like a figure carved from stone, her stillness now a presence that consumed the chamber. He tried to touch her, but when his hand neared her face, the shadows surged, pulling back like a warning growl from the unseen. He stumbled, his confidence slipping into fear, his voice cracking as he barked orders she did not obey. Then it happened, the stir inside her became undeniable. Her chest rose, her throat trembled, and though no sound escaped, the walls seemed to vibrate as if holding back a storm. He backed away, muttering that it was trickery, that she was cursed. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the floor, as if the house itself had grown hollow. From the corners of the room, shadows thickened into forms, elongated figures without faces, bending toward her like guardians awaiting command. She remained still, her silence holding the power of command, her muteness no longer a weakness but a shield. The husband screamed for help, but outside the door no one heard. The revelry of the village had dulled into drunken sleep, and even the guards posted at his compound lay slumped in slumber as though drugged by an unseen force. His cries seemed swallowed by the night itself, erased before they could escape. Only her silence remained, filling the chamber with a soundless roar. At last she turned her face fully toward him, and for the first time in his life, he saw fear reflected back at him, not his own power but hers. Though her lips never parted, he swore he could hear her voice, not in sound but in essence. It whispered through his mind like a blade through cloth, cutting deep, carrying with it every slight, every cruelty, every insult she had borne in silence. It was not a single voice but many, an echo of countless women's silence before her, now awakened within her. The lamps snuffed out suddenly, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint glow that seemed to radiate from her still figure. His body froze, his knees buckling as if bound by invisible hands. Sweat poured down his face, his breath choked in his throat, and his heart hammered like a trapped animal. The silence pressed harder and harder until it seemed it would crush him. And then, just before the night reached its deepest hour, her lips parted. No sound came, not yet, but the promise of it lingered like thunder before a storm. He knew then that her silence had been a womb for something terrible, something fated. The night of silence was not weakness, it was waiting. When he collapsed at her feet, trembling, it was not because she had spoken, but because he understood that when she finally did, it would not only be his doom but the doom of all who had mocked her muteness. The shadows swayed around her like worshippers, and she closed her eyes again, holding her silence for just a little longer. The storm had not yet broken, but its breath was already in the room. The night stretched long and heavy, thick with the weight of the unseen. Her husband still cowered in the corner of the chamber, his breath ragged, his hands trembling against the wooden floor. He dared not approach her, for the shadows that swirled around her form kept him at bay like guardians of some unspoken law. She sat at the center of the room, upright, still, her silence pressing into the walls until the very house seemed to bow beneath it. Then at last her chest rose sharply, her throat quivered, and she parted her lips. For the first time in her life the silence cracked. But what emerged was no human voice, it was the roar of thunder contained within a mortal body. It rolled through the chamber like a storm breaking free from captivity, rattling the windows and shaking the very beams of the house. Her husband covered his ears, screaming, but the sound was not meant for human ears alone. It was the language of spirits, of skies, of the earth that had been waiting to remember her. It was not merely noise, it was layered. Beneath the thunder was the hiss of rain, the wail of wind, the deep rumble of mountains shifting. The voice carried with it centuries of silenced women, their cries, their curses, their grief, and their vengeance. It filled the room, seared the air, and rippled outward beyond the compound walls. The guards who had been slumped in unnatural sleep awoke suddenly, choking and gasping as if dragged back from drowning. Villagers stirred in their beds, their dreams shattered by the echo of the impossible. Dogs barked, infants wailed, and the old stirred with trembling limbs, whispering that the girl without a voice had finally spoken. But it was more than a voice, it was power. The storm in her throat spilled into the night sky. Clouds gathered without warning, black and swollen, swallowing the stars. Lightning split the heavens, illuminating the village in harsh flashes of white. Thunder followed instantly, so loud it rattled bones and shook the ground. The villagers ran outside, their eyes wide, watching as winds tore through the huts, whipping fire from torches into sparks that scattered into the dark. Some dropped to their knees, calling her a goddess. Others screamed in terror, claiming the cursed child had awakened her doom. Inside the chamber, her husband tried to crawl toward the door, but the shadows blocked his path, pushing him back with force unseen. He fell onto his back, staring up at her as she rose slowly to her feet. She did not move like a frightened bride but like a storm given shape, her body swaying with the rhythm of the power spilling through her. Her eyes burned with a strange light, not of fire but of lightning's reflection, and her skin seemed alive, trembling as if the energy within her might burst at any moment. When she spoke again, the voice was sharper, clearer, cutting through air like a blade. "You mocked my silence," the storm said through her, though her lips barely moved. "You mistook it for emptiness. But silence is not nothing, it is waiting. And I have waited long enough." The words were not heard with ears but felt in bones, vibrating in marrow, a sound that bypassed flesh and pierced the soul. Her husband screamed until his throat broke raw, but his cries were swallowed instantly by the force of her voice. The roof above them shuddered, beams groaning as if ready to collapse. The earth beneath the chamber trembled, tiny cracks snaking across the floor. Outside, trees bent against winds that had no direction, pulled into spirals of chaos. Villagers clung to each other, some shouting prayers, others calling curses, all too afraid to enter the compound. The old woman who had once called her birth a blessing wept openly, whispering that the girl had been born for this moment, her silence merely the vessel for the storm. But amidst the chaos she stood calm. Though the storm spilled from her throat, she was not destroyed by it. She was its anchor, its chosen vessel, the one who could carry the rage of spirits without shattering. Her silence all her life had not been a curse but a protection, holding back what would have destroyed her too soon. Now at last it was free and she was strong enough to bear it. Her husband crawled to her feet, groveling, begging for mercy. His words tumbled out, desperate, incoherent, drowned by thunder each time he tried to speak. She lowered her gaze to him and for the first time she opened her mouth with intent, not to unleash chaos but to direct it. Her voice dropped into a growl, the sound of stone grinding against stone. You thought me weak because I was silent. You will learn that silence was the only mercy I ever gave you. And then she screamed. It was not a scream of fear but of release. The cry was raw thunder, piercing lightning, howling winds. The storm answered her. Lightning struck the ground outside the chamber, splitting trees and setting dry grass aflame. The earth shuddered violently, sending villagers sprawling. Her husband clutched his ears, blood seeping between his fingers, his body racked with pain as if the sound itself was tearing him apart. Still she did not falter. The sound poured out of her until the house itself split apart, walls shaking loose, the roof tearing away into the night. She stood tall amidst the ruin, her hair whipping wildly, her eyes blazing with stormlight. The villagers watched from a distance, some collapsing in worship, others fleeing into the forest, their screams carried by the wind. And then as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The wind stilled, the thunder quieted, the lightning withdrew into the dark sky. The girl closed her mouth and lowered her head. Her husband lay broken at her feet, his body trembling, his eyes wide with horror, unable to comprehend the storm that had come from his bride. The village lay scarred, huts half broken, trees split, the earth itself cracked. She stood in the silence she had reclaimed, no longer empty but sacred, and the people who had once mocked her now knew the truth. Her first sound was not meant to be a voice of belonging, but a voice of reckoning. The silence of her birth had been the warning. Her first word had been the doom. The night no longer belonged to the village. It belonged to her. What had begun as whispers of thunder within her throat grew into waves of fury that rolled outward, carrying judgment in every vibration. The guilty, those who had mocked her muteness, those who had laughed at her silence, those who had pressed her family into selling her like a token of shame, these were the first to feel her wrath. The storm did not waste time. It knew its targets. The first strike came without warning. A house near the edge of the village, one that had often hosted laughter at her expense, shuddered. Its mud walls began to crack as if invisible hands were prying them apart. The family inside screamed, clutching one another as dust rained from the ceiling. A lamp burst suddenly, flames shooting across the room before snuffing out in the same breath, leaving only smoke. The villagers outside heard their cries but dared not move to help. They knew what this was. It was the silence she had carried all her life, now turned into vengeance. Her voice rolled again, low and deep, rattling every roof beam and cooking pot in the village. The sound was not like speech but like the groan of the earth itself, heavy and ancient. Each guilty heart recognized its own doom in that rumble. The stepkin who had whispered that she was cursed clutched their ears as their bodies shook uncontrollably. They tried to run, but their steps faltered, their knees buckling as if the ground itself refused to carry them away. When they fell, the earth cracked beneath them, swallowing their screams before they could rise again. Another house collapsed under the pressure of her voice. Wooden beams split apart, falling like brittle sticks. The man who had arranged her marriage for wealth staggered into the open, gasping, his eyes wild with terror. He shouted to the others, blaming spirits, calling it witchcraft, but the sky above answered him with a bolt of lightning so bright it carved his shadow into the ground. His body crumpled, lifeless, smoke rising from his skin. The villagers gasped, some backing away, others falling to their knees, realizing that no human hand guided this destruction. It was her, and the storm she carried. Within the compound, her husband trembled, crawling on his knees as shards of broken clay scattered across the floor. He tried to reach her feet, to clutch at her garment for mercy, but she stepped back, her gaze locked on him with eyes that glowed like storm clouds lit from within. The air thickened with the weight of her voice as she spoke, Not a scream this time but a command. The silence you mocked is gone. The earth remembers. The sky remembers. You will remember me only in ruin. As her words fell, the torches lining the compound's walls shattered one by one, sparks exploding into the air. The shadows swirled violently, no longer mere darkness but living extensions of her voice, grasping and pulling at the guilty who tried to hide. One man who had often called her cursed in the market, ran toward the gates, his cries piercing. But before he could cross, the gates slammed shut with a force that splintered wood. His body was hurled backward, flung as if by unseen hands, and he lay broken, his mouth frozen in a scream that would never end. The night itself seemed to pulse with her wrath. Each time she exhaled, the wind howled through the village, tearing at roofs and scattering belongings into the air. Each time her voice rose, something broke, walls cracked open, vessels shattered, fires sparked and died. But it was not random. Only those who had raised themselves against her, those who had profited from her silence, those who had called her weak, these were struck down. Innocent villagers cowered in their huts, clutching their children, whispering prayers, but the storm passed over them like a shadow that knew its boundaries. And then the final horror began. Her voice grew clearer, sharper, no longer thunder or wind but words carried on a storm. She began to name them, one by one. Their names rolled like drumbeats through the air, and with each name spoken, a scream followed, torn from the guilty as they were claimed by the shadows or struck by lightning. Some tried to cover their ears but it did not matter. The voice was not only heard, it lived inside them, shaking their bones, unraveling their very breath. The village had never known a night like this. Women wept as the guilty fell one after another, not by sword or spear but by sound itself, by a power too vast to comprehend. Men held their children close, warning them never to mock silence, never to taunt the weak, never to force a soul into chains. The earth trembled with each fall, and the sky split with flashes that burned the horizon. At the heart of it all, she stood, not swaying, not breaking, but rooted like the storm's very center. Her hair whipped around her face, her garments billowed, but her body did not falter. She was no longer the girl born voiceless, she was the storm's vessel, the spirit's mouthpiece, the silence turned into judgment. Her husband lay prostrate at her feet, his body shaking, his lips begging, but his pleas dissolved in the roar of her words. By the time the night had worn halfway through, half the guilty were gone, their homes reduced to rubble, their names erased from the living. The survivors dared not flee, for they knew there was no place far enough to escape her reach. The villagers whispered that it was no longer the girl they knew, it was the spirits themselves speaking through her, punishing every soul who had forgotten that silence is not weakness, but power waiting to awaken. And so the guilty suffered, their doom written not in blood but in sound, their names carried on the voice that had once been denied. What had been buried in silence all her life now shook the night with destruction, ensuring that no mockery, no cruelty, no greed could ever survive unpunished. The storm had spread across the village, swallowing houses, breaking walls, and scattering the guilty into the shadows, but at the center of it all stood her husband, the man who thought he had purchased her silence like one might purchase a goat or a sack of grain. On the night of the wedding, when he took her into his compound, he believed he owned her entirely. To him, her voicelessness meant submission, meant obedience, meant she could never shame him, never answer back, never resist. But as the storm raged and her voice split the night into fragments of thunder, he realized too late that her silence had never been weakness, it had been power waiting, biding its time, growing in depth until the spirits themselves chose to unleash it. The moment he saw her eyes glow, he felt the truth burn into him. Those eyes were not the eyes of a wife brought to heal. They were the eyes of judgment, of storm, of eternity itself watching him. His knees gave way beneath him and he fell forward, palms pressed into the trembling earth. His lips stuttered prayers, but even the prayers would not form correctly. His tongue felt swollen, his breath caught as though the very air refused to carry words for him. And then, above the roar of the wind, above the crashing of splitting wood and the terrified cries of villagers, came her voice. Not the muttered sound of thunder this time, not the chaotic rumble that swallowed the guilty whole. No, this time it was deliberate, focused, sharpened like a blade made of sound. She spoke his name. It was not screamed. It was not whispered. It was declared. The name fell into the world with a weight that made the ground tremble. The villagers froze in their hiding places, listening. They knew that name. It was the name of the man who had claimed her as property, who had laughed with his friends at her muteness, who had believed her silence meant he could do as he pleased. Now his name echoed across the night like a death sentence. The husband's body convulsed when he heard it, His ears rang as though struck by a drum louder than thunder. His vision blurred and he clutched at his chest, gasping. He tried to crawl toward her, dragging himself through shards of broken clay and splintered wood, blood smearing across his knees. "Mercy!" he cried, his voice cracking thin against the storm. "I did not know. I did not understand." But her glowing gaze did not soften. She took a step closer, her voice rising again, repeating his name, each syllable heavier, sharper, as though carving into his bones. He felt it resonate in his very marrow, stripping away every defense he had built. For years he had commanded others with that name, had used it to seal bargains, to assert dominance, to demand respect. Now it was turned against him, his own name his undoing. The villagers watched from cracks in their doors as the storm obeyed her words. Each time she spoke his name, lightning carved across the sky, striking dangerously close to where he cowered. The earth split beneath his feet, steam rising from the cracks. He screamed louder, clutching his head, but the storm did not release him. Shadows slithered across the ground, climbing up his arms like snakes of smoke, binding him in place. He tried to call her wife, the word shaking on his tongue, but the sound dissolved before it left his lips. Her voice thundered again and the word never reached her ears. Instead, he fell flat against the ground, his forehead pressed into the dirt, trembling as though he could bury himself to escape her. His heart pounded, frantic, but even his heartbeat could not outpace the storm she carried. For a moment, the night seemed to hold its breath. She raised her chin, and her hair whipped about her face like banners of shadow. Her voice, calm and unshaken, called his name one last time. This time the sound was not loud, it was quiet, so quiet that it slipped into every corner of the night, into every crack of the earth, into every frightened villager's ear. The silence after it was suffocating, as if the entire world was waiting for what would come next. The husband opened his mouth to scream, but no sound left him. His jaw hung open, his eyes bulged, his body shivered violently, and then, he was gone. Not struck down with blood or flame, not crushed by falling wood, but swallowed by the very shadows that obeyed her. They wrapped him whole, and in a blink he vanished into the trembling earth, his last breath stolen, his name erased. The villagers who heard it whispered to one another later that it was fitting. Her first true words were his undoing, her first call of power sealed his fate. The man who thought silence meant weakness had learned too late that silence was only the storm's beginning, and when the voice finally came, it was doom itself. And in the stillness after his disappearance, she stood taller, her eyes burning brighter. For the first time in her life she was not silent. For the first time she was truly free. Her voice did not end with her husband's disappearance. What began in the wedding house, where lamps shattered and shadows twisted at the sound of her words, now spilled outward, traveling like ripples across a still pond that had just been struck by lightning. The storm outside bent to her command, carrying her voice into every corner of the village. What had once been a night of feasting and laughter was now a night of unrelenting terror. The walls of nearby homes trembled as if they too recognized guilt. Mud walls cracked, splitting apart as though they could no longer contain the secrets they had been built around. Roofs of straw and thatch caught fire without flame, bursting into sudden ash as her voice swept over them. The air was heavy, suffocating, every breath filled with dust and smoke. No one could hide from it. Children clutched their mothers, but even the mothers could not comfort them, for they too trembled, fearing their own sins might be named next. Those who had laughed at her silence, who had joined in whispers about her being cursed, felt their hearts pound like drums. They heard her voice inside their ears, not shouting, not screaming, but humming, echoing like the sound of deep waters pulling them under. Some collapsed to the ground, clutching their heads, begging for it to stop. The guilty were the first to feel the full weight of her power. A woman who had once mocked her muteness during the wedding feast, standing in the corner of the courtyard, now screamed as her clay pots burst into shards, slicing her skin as though the very household she had filled with pride turned against her. An elder who had advised the marriage bargain to bind the girl into obedience found his walking stick snapping in half, the ground beneath him splitting so that he tumbled helplessly into a fissure, his cries swallowed before anyone could reach him. Her voice carried names, slowly, deliberately. Every guilty villager who had sneered at her silence, every hand that had forced her fate, every mouth that had whispered her cursed rumors. One by one she spoke them and the storm answered. The wind did not scatter randomly, it tore the roofs of the guilty, leaving others untouched. Lightning struck with intention, spearing through huts where laughter at her expense had once lived. The earth itself seemed to open its memory, revealing where each cruel deed had been planted, dragging its owner into the soil as repayment. Yet even as the storm punished the wicked, the innocent watched in frozen terror. Mothers who had once pitied her, children too young to mock her, men who had kept their distance from cruelty, they stood in corners, shaking, not daring to move. The girl's voice passed over them like a shadow, heavy but sparing, as though weighing their hearts before deciding. Some fainted from fear, but when they opened their eyes they found themselves still alive, though surrounded by ruins. The entire village seemed alive with destruction. Goats bleated wildly, breaking free from their ropes, running into the darkness. Chickens scattered, their feathers torn into the air. Drums left out from the wedding feast began to pound on their own, hollow beats drowned in thunder. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and wet soil, with the sharp tang of lightning. Some of the guilty tried to run, believing they could escape her voice if they fled into the fields or toward the river. But her voice followed them like a shadow, no matter how far they went. The ground turned to mud beneath their feet, dragging them down. The river they thought would be refuge rose higher, its waters thrashing like a beast, pulling them under. It was as if the entire land had joined her judgment, every root, every stone, every wave becoming her ally. In the center of the village she stood motionless, her eyes still glowing, her lips parting only to release more sound that was both storm and spirit. The sound itself did not feel human anymore, it was layered, like the cries of ancestors and the roar of the earth together. It was not one girl's voice, it was all voices silenced unjustly, returned to speak through her. The wedding house where it had begun was now nothing but rubble. The tall posts that once held its roof were snapped in two, its decorated mats scattered into the night air, its jars of palm wine spilled and broken. Around it, other homes collapsed, fields flattened, and the once celebratory village square became a pit of shattered clay and smoldering straw. The villagers who survived, those who had never lifted hand or tongue against her, watched in horror as the place they had called home dissolved into ruin. Some wept openly, not only for the destruction but for the realization that they had done nothing to stop the cruelty that led to this. Even silence, they realized, could be guilt when it allowed evil to thrive. By the time the storm's fury began to calm, the village no longer resembled itself. Where laughter had once filled the air during festivals, only echoes of cries and collapsing walls remained. Where families had lived for generations, only broken stones and twisted trees stood. And at the heart of it all, she remained standing, taller than before, her voice finally quiet but still vibrating in the air, as though the earth itself was holding onto its sound. The survivors knew in that moment that the village was no longer theirs. It was hers. Her voice had claimed it. Her silence had ended, and what it left behind was not a home but a graveyard of guilt. The village was now a ruin, a monument carved not by time, but by the voice of a girl once thought powerless. And in every ruined corner the message lingered. Silence can be mistaken for weakness, but when silence breaks, it can destroy all that mocks it. At dawn, the village looked nothing like the place it had been just hours before. Where there had once been music, laughter, and the clinking of drinking gourds, there was only broken wood, smoldering thatch, and a silence so deep it pressed into the chest like a stone. The wedding house was nothing but splinters. Trees that had stood for generations leaned at strange angles, their roots torn by the force of something unnatural. Animals refused to enter the place, circling its borders nervously, as though sensing what humans could not name. But she was gone. The girl who had lived her entire life in silence, who had been treated as both curse and omen, had vanished into the night. None saw her leave. None heard her footsteps. It was as if the storm had swallowed her whole, carrying her beyond reach. All that remained were the echoes of her voice, lingering in the air like thunder that refuses to fade. Children who woke that morning swore they could still feel the ground trembling beneath their bare feet. Her husband, or what was left of him, was found among the ruins, his body twisted as though caught between fear and pleading. Some said his name still echoed faintly in the wind, called again and again by the voice that had undone him. The elders of the village gathered, their faces pale with the weight of a story already too heavy for their tongues. They whispered of her disappearance, but more importantly of what she had left behind. A warning carved not in stone but in memory. From that day parents would tell their children, "Do not mock the quiet ones. Do not think silence means weakness. For silence is only the waiting of thunder before it strikes." The tale of the voiceless bride spread quickly, carried by traveling merchants and wandering storytellers. Each village added its own shape to the tale, but at its heart remained the same truth, that the earth remembers those who suffer in silence, and when their voice finally comes, it is not a song of peace but of reckoning. Generations later, people still spoke of her. Children who teased their quieter siblings were hushed by mothers who reminded them of the girl born without a voice. Farmers working in the fields glanced at the sky when the wind shifted strangely, murmuring prayers that her echo did not find them guilty of hidden cruelties. At festivals, when drums were beaten too loudly, some elders would close their eyes, as though listening for something beneath the rhythm, a reminder of the night when thunder itself came from a human throat. Her absence became her greatest presence. Though she had vanished into the unseen places of the world, she lived in every cautionary tale, every hushed warning, every shiver that ran down the spine when the air grew heavy before a storm. She was no longer just the mute girl who had been married off for convenience. She was a figure of justice cloaked in silence, her story woven into the very soil of the land. And so the legend endured. Silence, once mocked, had spoken, and its voice was doom. Those who heard the tale understood that some burdens are not meant to be scorned. Some silences are not emptiness but power waiting for the right night to awaken. And when it does, there is no escape, no bargain, no mercy. When dawn broke over that ruined village, it carried with it the first of many warnings. The story of the girl without a voice would never again belong to one family or one village. It belonged to all who feared silence, all who misunderstood it, all who thought it harmless. For every generation to come, her tale would stand as a reminder: beware the silence you mock, because when it speaks, it will not whisper. It will roar.